title of my talk is, What Does It Mean to Be an Honest Broker? And the talk really has three parts. And the first is describing a categorization of how scientists interact with policymakers, in which different roles that they have. And one of those roles is as an honest broker. And in the main part of the talk, I want to describe a project in which we have tried to flesh out this role of an honest broker. And then rather than talk in generalities, I'm going to give a concrete example. So this is a project where we've looked at a very contentious issue of science and policy in the UK, which is the control of bovine TB. I should say, I've said they're scientists, different roles. And when I say scientists, I mean both social scientists and natural scientists. So it's essentially how experts of different types talk to policymakers. And then right at the end, in a sort of single slide, I want to, without coming to any conclusions, explore some of the wider issues of science and the interactions with policymakers and with the general public, including some of the issues which I think have been brought up by the pandemic. The pandemic really has focused on some of the issues about how science and policymakers interact. So, to begin with, so what are the different roles scientists have in communicating with broader publics beyond their own field? And there are many ways you can characterize this, but I particularly like a taxonomy that the American sort of thinker about the role of science and policy, Roger Pielke, his taxonomy of scientists' roles. And he talks about four main types of roles we have, and also argues that we are often not very clear what role that we have. And the first is the sort of pure scientist role. So quite often we as scientists, and again natural and social sciences, we need to talk to each other to try and get our science better before we come anywhere near policymakers. And often and erroneously, we expose policymakers to this discourse at too early a stage. And so that element of pure science, of scientists talking to each other, is there, but is not the important bit by which scientists interact with policymakers. Now, I think if you ask many scientists, they will often see that their role, or think that their role, is as an arbiter, actually being given a problem by policymakers, which they go out to solve. And Pielke argues, and I very much agree with him, that this is actually an incredibly rare role in which we occupy. One example of this might be some very technical issues. So, for example, if one's planning a measles vaccination strategy, then do you vaccinate children age X or Y? So a very technical question which doesn't really involve other issues of policy. I mean, it could involve economics. I will give you an example of the only time that I think I've been an arbiter in interacting with policymakers. And this goes back actually quite a long time ago. But it also gives me an excuse to be a biologist again and to actually show you some real insects in there. They are the only ones you'll get in the talk. The horrible goo at the top is the mango mealybug. And this is a South American insect that was introduced into West Africa and became rampant on mangoes. And mangoes are an important crop, both an informal crop and a real crop. For those of you who've been to West Africa and been into a small village in West Africa, you'll know that in the middle of a village, there is always a big mango tree, typically with seats around it. And when you have a really bad infestation of these things, the rain of honeydew, it's like when you park your car under a lime tree in the spring. So it is interesting, it's an economic pest, it's also a social pest as well. So, as I said, this bug comes from South America, where it is attacked by a variety of what are called parasitic wasps. And these are the insects that I love. They're the insects I spent a lot of my early career studying on. And they lay their eggs into the mealybug, and the eggs develop and eventually emerge. These are small insects, 1 or 2 millimeters long. Now, an organization called the International Institute of Biological Control was tasked with bringing these 2 parasitoids from South America to Africa to try and control the mealybug. The taxonomy all done at the Natural History Museum by John Noyes. And they brought both of these insects over, and they had to decide which of the 2 insects to invest in breeding up into large numbers and then distributing throughout West Africa. And so I was involved, and I'm not going to go into any of the details here, of trying to model the effect of introducing these 2 parasitoids on the mango mealybug. And there's quite a lot we knew about them, and there was stuff we didn't know. And the stuff we didn't know, sort of you could summarize by 2 parameters. I'm not going to bore you with the biology and just call them unknown parameter A and unknown parameter B. And we sort of thought that actually the 2 parameters would be fairly similar between the two insects. And we got a very clear result. So this is bad, high population densities, good, low population densities. The prediction was that introducing this one, Gyranusoidea, would be better. And we made that prediction. They went ahead and released it. And it was a highly successful biological control attempt. So this is an example, I think, of where it's a scientist acting purely as an arbiter. But I will tell one postscript for this. So I rather sort of preened myself, and this being an example of actually policy-relevant science. And it was only 5 years later that I met some of the people who are actually working in the fields in this. And they actually admitted that this one went extinct in their cultures. So that was the only one they had to release anyway. So that was a slight disappointment for my pathway to impact statement. So that's an example of scientists acting as arbiter, and I would argue is quite a rare instance of how we interact. The third one is where scientists act as advocates. So they are actually arguing normatively for a particular thing to happen. And when they do that, they are integrating not only their knowledge of the science, the special knowledge that they bring from being a scientist, but they're integrating that with their worldview, perhaps their assumptions about things well outside their own field, including things such as economics and political preference. And it's absolutely the right thing for scientists to be advocates. But when they do that, Pielke's argument, which I strongly agree with, is that it is very clear that they are acting as advocates and that they are, yes, bringing specialist knowledge to the table, but they're also bringing their broader view as well. They're not abusing the authority of science as the unique way that we have for understanding about the natural world. And of course, we as scientists, we can operate in all these roles simultaneously. I mean, solipsistically, I'm going to give 2 examples of where I act as advocates. And one, I'm doing this just because Mike's in the audience, but I am a strong advocate of the importance of taxonomy in modern day science. I think I'm a critical friend of taxonomy. I think it has to change. I used to be a trustee of Kew, and I've been on the science board at the Natural History Museum. And then I am passionate about the importance of doing something about climate change. And I will talk no more about it now, but at the Martin School, we've done a lot in this area, including something, and I take no personal responsibility for this, but I think a really interesting guide to how one corporate investment in portfolios of things which have different effects on climate. But what I want to spend most of the time talking about today is the 4th role, and this is the role of honest broker. And I want to do that by giving an example of a project that we have set up at the Martin School. And when you're being an honest broker, you are trying to, in a dispassionate way, set forth an evidence base in a way that is non-normative and in a way that is not necessarily advocating one particular policy outcome. So it is aiming to be policy neutral. And the project that I've been involved with in Oxford has been what we call the Oxford Martin School Restatement Project. This is very much something that I've done jointly with Angela McLean, who I'm delighted to say is in the audience. Dame Angela is now CSA, Chief Scientific Advisor at the Ministry of Defence and Deputy Government Chief Scientific Advisor. So in some ways it's a sort of poacher turned gamekeeper, or the other way around. I'm not sure what the correct metaphor there. And the way this project came about is we've both been involved in policy advice to DEFRA. And Angela, whose background is in epidemiology and in more medical fields, sort of said, well, why has DEFRA never done what is so common in the medical world, doing big meta-analysis, the Cochrane program and things like that, systematically getting information together? And we sort of worked through it, and for many of the issues that policymakers confront, especially in the environment, it's really complex. There are not the multiple experiments and types of data that one gets, for example, in medicine. Now, medicine has many, many challenges, but one of the advantages medics have is that their unit of replication is essentially us. So it is possible to do multiple experiments. It is possible to do multiple randomized control trials. It is possible to do the synthesis of these multiple control trials. And that is seldom possible in many of the areas that we're interested. Typically, there are one or a few experiments. Typically, there is evidence of a much weaker type than experiments. There is a temptation for us as scientists to say, oh, we can't give advice now, we need to go and do more experiments, give us a research grant or something like that. But that's the last thing you can say to policymakers. Policymakers can't wait for 3 years in a research grant. Policymakers have to do something now. So what an Oxford Martin restatement does is it takes a topic and it tries to summarize independently the natural science evidence base, sometimes a bit of social science in it. The projects we've done so far, the target has been policymakers, the type of sort of senior civil servant who may not be an expert in the field, but is smart and interdisciplinary and well-read into it. It aims to be policy neutral. It's nothing new. It's, we call it restatements because we're not trying to say we're doing new analyses. We are summarizing the existing data in a way that is amenable to understanding by the audience. And it's very clear about where uncertainty exists, so it doesn't hide away from uncertainty. The typical way we've gone about it, and we've now done it 7 times, is to identify, we joke and call it a super stakeholder and other stakeholders. So the example I'm going to give in a moment is Bovine TB, and their DEFRA, our Environment and Agriculture department, was our main stakeholder. The philosophy is very much this should not be us in the academy coming up with a problem that we find interesting. It's not a push from us to policymakers, but very much the other way around, a pull from the policy world. And then what we do, just to briefly go through it, we recruit an expert group, we draft a restatement, we have, and it varies a bit from time to time, but we have iterations of coming up with a statement. We then go out and do stakeholder consultation. So typically when we have a draft restatement, we send it out to maybe 20 or 30 people and challenge them to come back and say what is wrong. And those of you who publish papers and throw your hands up when you have to take account of 2 or 3 referees, then feel sorry for us when you come back with 30 referees. But it's such an important part of the of the process. And then it goes through iterative revision with the expert group. And then finally it's published. And in fact, the traditional external peer review right at the end is much less important in this process than it is in a typical paper because of the extensive reviews beforehand. And so far, all of the outputs, the restatements, have been published in one of the journals of the Royal Society. And again, they took a little bit of convincing because it is a really rather odd format. There's a paper which is essentially a stub, just a short couple of paragraphs and a method section. And then the restatement itself comes in as an appendix. And it's a list of, it's a numbered list of statements where the evidence is summarized. And again, we keep trying to make it in a way that is easily accessible to our target audience, which are not scientists, not the complete general public, people who have some knowledge in the area. And so these are the standalone statements, and then for each statement, there is a really quite detailed bibliography and reference list at the end. So the restatement itself, we hope that as a senior civil servant, a DG or permanent secretary level, will be able to read it as a standalone thing, and then he or she or one of their people who work for them may actually want to delve down and to question exactly what the evidence base is underlying the assumptions. So let me give you a concrete example of a project we've done, and this involves bovine TB. And bovine TB, which is closely related to human TB, is a disease that affects a number of animals, but in this country, particularly among livestock cattle. And it's a horrible disease. That's a calf that is suffering from it. It used to be a disease that was also a public health problem, but since the days of pasteurization, that has largely gone. It's a disease that, apart from the animal welfare harm, is also economic because of the direct effect on livestock condition, but also the indirect effect on trade. So it is a really important disease. For reasons that are not completely clear, and there's a huge literature and a discussion on this, it has been getting steadily worse since the mid-1980s. And I'll show you where we are now, but this takes it up to about 2012, which was just before we did this restatement project in 2014. So you can see it continuing to grow. It's seasonal, hence the spikes. And there's a big gap there, which was the foot and mouth epidemic, when no vets could get out into the field to test cattle. And then I hope you can see it. This is from 1986 to 2010, a heat map of the UK, where the hotspots of infections are in bright colours. And you can see that this is a disease that's a particular problem in the West Country and in Wales, but has spread so that Oxfordshire, which used to be largely clear of the disease, is now right on the edge of the high-risk area. So why is this a difficult policy question? Well, there are a number of reasons for it. And, I mean, to summarize it, if you set out to make a disease that was going to be difficult to study, both within the individual animal and for the transmission and epidemiology, you'd come up with something such as bovine TB. It's an intracellular bacteria, so it's difficult to test. There are a variety of diagnostic tests. They're difficult to use. There's an element of arbitrariness in how you assess it. There's not a simple sort of PCR lateral flow equivalent that one can apply there. There is a wildlife reservoir, and the wildlife reservoir is the badger. So again, if you were to pick the worst wildlife reservoir to study, you'd end up with something that lives underground and comes out at night. And that's what we have with the badger. There's a really complex biology in transmission of which we only understand components of it. And of course, the badger is an iconic member of the UK fauna. People really care about badgers, and that leads to huge political complexities. So there are a huge number of policy questions that DEFRA and policymakers have to go through. There is a poor evidence base informing them, and that evidence base was considerably contested. And what we set out to do was to try and summarize the evidence base in a neutral way to try and remove some of that contestation. And we did this with a wonderful expert group, and I won't go through everyone here. And we picked them deliberately because they, when they were in advocacy mode, they had different opinions about what we should be doing for this disease in the country. But one of the great things was that although they had advocacy positions, they immediately got what we were trying to do with being honest brokers. And they were able to, largely successfully, I think, Angela, switch off the advocacy things and really engage in the honest broker bit. And in fact, during the iterations, it was really quite fun. We were sort of working over words and particular sentence construction, but in a positive way. So I mentioned earlier that one of the things that we do is to try and give an assessment of the type of evidence. I won't go through these, but this was a sort of a reserved vocabulary that we came up with to give some indication of the type of evidence. Whether there was really quite a detailed experimental and evidence base, something that was unlikely to change in the future as more evidence came in, areas where it was much less clear, and then when you were really going down to expert opinion or making projections and assumptions from other diseases. And of course you can say, well, we shouldn't be using that type of evidence. That is not gold standard randomized controlled trial, but you're still throwing stuff out, and policymakers don't have the luxury of waiting. They have to do things today. I'm not going to give a lecture on bovine TB epidemiology here. I'm just going to hint at some of the issues that we explored, and we tried to come up with a restatement from it. So areas of contention, things we didn't know. We didn't know then, and we still don't know, why it is spreading and how it is spreading, and why some farms are hotspots and others, even in a high-risk area, manage to get away without it. And there's been a large amount of statistical work trying to find correlates of infection and non-infection, and has produced some evidence, but not very clear evidence. And that includes also persistence of infection in clear herds. You can have a herd that tests negative for a number of cycles, then suddenly the disease appears again. And it seems clear that this has been an infection that's been overlooked. There are issues about how one tries to test better. And again, those of you who have a background in this area will know that there's often a trade-off between sensitivity and specificity. And you're trading off undiagnosing individuals against overdiagnosing individuals. Farmers are encouraged to do a huge amount of stuff to try and keep badgers separate from their cattle, to try and keep their cattle herd separate from the herd next door. These come under the rubric of biosecurity. A lot of them are sort of no regrets, you know. Make certain that where you keep your cattle in winter, the barn doesn't have a hole in it. That badger will come in to eat some of the cattle food. Others of it cost more money. The evidence base is poor about what works and what doesn't work. Something where there is quite strong evidence that it does work is restrictions on cattle movements. And farmers absolutely hate this for completely understandable reasons. Farmers are extremely adroit at working out where to sell their cattle and how to maximize their income. And cattle movement restrictions severely affect that. There was a lot of discussion and contestation about lessons from other countries. I'm half New Zealand, so I know about possums in New Zealand. Possums are the reservoirs in New Zealand. To good approximation, apart from a few bats, New Zealand has no native terrestrial mammals. And this invasive Australian possum is what they have. And New Zealand is like nothing better than killing possums. It doesn't have the iconic status of badgers over here. So they're really interesting social science as well as natural science lessons about what you can deduce from has happened in New Zealand and other countries as well. Many issues about vaccination, both in cattle and the possibility of doing them in badgers. But the single thing that has the greatest problem, that has the greatest area of contention, is whether we should cull badgers or not. And again, anyone who looks at the media in this country over the last 10 years, and still continuing today, although perhaps to a slightly lesser extent, is the issue about should we cull badgers. Now, there was evidence that one of the reasons why the epidemic took off in the mid-80s was that we had stopped controlling badgers. But of course, that was just one observation. It was one interpretation of what has happened. And in the late 80s, John Krebs, who many of you will know, now Lord Krebs, who was in the biology department here, was asked to do a report to recommend to review the evidence on whether badgers were reservoirs of bovine TB and what we should do about it. And John recommended one of the most ambitious large-scale experiments that has ever been done in the United Kingdom. Now, most people call it the Krebs trial, but just in case John happens to be looking in, I've called it by its proper name, the Randomized Badger Control Trial. John doesn't like it being called the Krebs trial. And what it did was to do a replicated experiment. And going back to what I said, what makes this work hard is that the replicate here is an area, a large area. You can see the size of them on the map. These are big geographical areas. So I have huge respect for my medical colleagues, but your unit of replication is an individual. The unit of replication, the study about this, is multiple parishes. So this is a big experiment. And it was designed by having 10 replicate triplets. And in each triplet, there were one of 3 treatments. One was a control, survey only. Another was a reactive cull, which was to do nothing until you had an outbreak, and then you went in and you killed badgers. And the third one was a proactive cull, where you actually went in and killed badgers right from the start. So this was hugely ambitious. It was carried out with, I know the people who did the work, and it was almost military precision that was needed to carry this out. But it ran immediately into problems because 2 years after it was set up, the foot and mouth outbreak happened, and so that caused all sorts of delays. And then there were some issues with the reactive cull, which led to the reactive treatment being abandoned. There was some initial evidence that the reactive cull was making it worse, and there was a theory that the reason why this was happening was that badgers were being disturbed by the reactive cull and then were dispersing and so spreading the infection. I think looking back on it, that treatment was probably closed too soon, but at the time it was a very difficult decision to make. So this was an extraordinary experiment. I'm going to put up the results. Now, I'm not going to talk about the results in any detail, but I put it up just to show some of the issues with interpreting this data. And actually, this was a graph that we put together. We felt that other analyses of it were very difficult to interpret. And you'll see, just looking at the blizzard there, that it's not the easiest thing to interpret. This is what was happening during the experiment, and that was happening after the experiment. And they were sampling. The red lines are the areas, sorry, let me just get this right. The black lines are the effects of the cull. So it's the reduction in bovine TB cases in the areas where you're culling. So right at the beginning, there's no difference. During the course of the cull, you're getting an effect of fewer outbreaks in the areas where you're culling. You stop culling here, and the good effect from the point of view of the farmer effect of the culling then continues into the future, although quite quickly the standard error bars mean that it's not statistically significant from 0. So that tends to show a moderate positive effect of culling. But if you look at the red bars, this is the areas around the culling areas. And in these areas, the effects went up. The amount of herd breakdowns, as they're called, the amount of infections went up. And again, this might be due, the explanation that is most likely is it's due to the culling causing badgers to disperse and spread the disease. So again, I've perhaps given you a bit more bovine TB epidemiology than you wanted to know, but I hope I sort of imparted to you the complexity of this. I think if you do all the sums and you talk about the effects of culling, and you sort of integrate the surrounding areas with the actual control areas, you have of the order of a 20% reduction in herd breakdowns, a 20% reduction in infections. And what we tried to do in the restatement was make that very clear. And then the issue is, how important is that? If you're an animal rights person, you say, well, 20%, that's not very much. If you're a farmer, you might say, well, that really is significant. And I should say, this is a horrible disease if you're a farmer. Many farmers have looked after herds of cattle for 20, 30 years and then see them destroyed once they get an infection. So in no way underestimate the negative effects this has on farmers. So I hope that gives you a little bit of the flavor of how to do, of how we did a restatement. We were delighted by the reception that the restatement had. The government every 2 or 3 years revises its bovine TB strategy, and the appendix of the strategy is the evidence base upon which they make the evidence. And the review of the strategy that came out 18 months after we reported didn't have an evidence base. They just quoted our paper. So we were really delighted by that. So DEFRA has used that a lot. We sort of feel it's been generally accepted by both sides. Both sides work from the restatement and make their own advocacy case, which is exactly right. But I don't think anyone has accused us of being unfair in trying to put the evidence out there in a policy-neutral way. Just before going on, to sort of finish off the story, I've put here the course of the disease from when we did the restatement, which was about there till today. And you can see we're still suffering from the disease. There is some evidence that it's going down slightly, but it is still a major issue, and there is evidence of geographical spread as well. I think some of the ferocity of the debate has gone off it. Not completely, but some of the completely over-the-top arguments from both sides, one sees less of that now. I hope that we've done a little bit in contributing to this lessening of the ferocity of the debate. I would also point out a couple of individuals who've had a very major role in this. A man called Ian Boyd, who was Chief Scientific Advisor at DEFRA, did a wonderful job in reaching out to both the farming community and the people arguing against culling. And Brian May, the guitarist from Queen, who many of you will know with the wonderful hair, became very closely involved in this debate and had a wonderful role. And he is very, very much against culling, but had a wonderful role in trying to get a more recent discourse on this. And I think bringing it right up to date, and I was involved in doing a report 3 years back on a renewal of government bovine TB strategy. There's some really interesting questions about why bovine TB is more of a problem in this country than in any other country. And in essence, it's a way that we have chosen to farm, especially in the West Country. We've chosen to farm in the West Country with many small, typical dairy beef herds in fields which are strongly fertilized by nitrogen, leading to a very large worm population, interspersed with woodland, which are great for badgers to build their colonies. Essentially, the West Country is almost a petri dish for badgers. We have a higher density of badgers there than would have existed before farming started. So many of the problems are also issues with the structure of farming. And I'm not someone who takes any pleasure at all from Brexit, but if one's searching for a silver lining on Brexit, there are things that we're able to do with the future of farming in the UK outside the Common Agricultural Policy. And I hope that when we try and work this out, then thinking about how a post-cap farming regime might actually help to reduce the disease will be part of it. So just briefly to finish up, we've now done 6 restatements, and we have another one in review. In addition to bovine TB, we've looked at a particular class of insecticides which has a very contentious role about the effect it has on pollinating insects. We've done one on the biological effects of low-dose radiation, on endocrine disruptors, some of these so-called forever chemicals which go into the environment, and also on flood risk management, and a current one we're doing is on Campylobacter. So that's, along with Salmonella, the bacteria that very frequently causes food poisoning. And this final slide in this part of the talk, I just want to list what I think are some of the lessons that we've learned from restatements, and both some of the things where we've done well and areas where I think that we found it harder or that we've been justifiably criticized. I think one of the really nice things is that there does seem to have been a real need for restatement or restatement-like efforts. We've had great feedback from policymakers and saying this is the type of thing that can be very helpful. One thing that's very important is trust in policymakers, and also the restatement, I'm not sure if this is the right word, but it's built up somewhat of a brand. When Sir John Beddington, who was then Chief Scientific Advisor, heard that Angela and I were doing a restatement on badgers, he said, and it came back to us, I hope Charles and Angela flipping know what they're doing. I suspect that might have been the word beginning with F he actually used. And again, what John was worried about, and I think rightly worried about, was that this would be an exercise in pretending to be an honest broker, but actually advocating a particular course of action. And Steve Rayner, who many of you will know, a wonderful sort of philosopher of science, who died 3 years ago in Oxford, Steve coined the term crypto advocacy for cases where people were saying they were being an honest broker, but actually either deliberately, although much more frequently accidentally, were actually being an advocate. I think that something like restatements are most useful where there is a clear policy question. So the ones we've done, I think it'd be interesting here if Angela thinks the same, the ones that have been most successful have been ones on bovine TB, on neonicotinoids, to a certain extent on river management, where there is a clear policy question out there. Whereas the ones we've done on endocrine disruptor, it was almost too big. So I think this approach works best when there is a clear policy question. And I should also say where it is contentious. someone in DEFRA said, I'm not sure we could have done the bovine TB restatement, but even if we had have done it, no one would have trusted it because it came from within DEFRA. So I think the fact that we're independent, the fact that very luckily through the Martin School, we're completely self-funded in this, we take no money from outside, is really important. When we were starting it, people were saying, well, the problem is you'll do your restatement and people will just cherry pick whatever evidence that they want for their particular advocacy position. That's happened to a certain extent, but I think nowhere near as much as we worried about. And Angela came up with the very nice simile, I think, is that, yes, people can cherry pick, but because all the cherries are on the table, all the fruit are on the table, then it's very obvious when that's done. I think some of the shortcomings of this approach is it's difficult to scale up. They take a lot of work. I think when you get to my age, then most tasks that I do as a scientist are done much, much better by young people, by early career researchers. And restatements is sort of one of the things where it's much harder to get really bright young people to do it. It's just one of those things where it actually helps being a bit of an old fart, to be honest, on it. One thing we worry about a lot is the difficulty in keeping it relevant. We actually did 2 on neonics. We did 1 on neonics, and then a whole load of experiments came through, and Mark Walpert, then CSA, asked to do it another. I think ideally one would almost like it to be a web exercise, which is sort of kept up, but it would be a lot of work to do that. We have come under criticism by people who say, well, restatements involve a lot of expert judgment, and expert judgment almost by necessity is suspect. And I think if you look at some of the controversies within the Cochrane world, within the medical world at the moment, there are views that these evidence, within the medical world, the evidence meta-analysis need to be done almost completely automatically, that actually having experts involved can be detrimental because they bring prior opinions to it. And of course, where we have expert judgment in, then the people who find that difficult really don't like it. And I guess the argument we have against it is that in the absence of the plentiful replicated statistical randomized controlled trials, one almost inevitably has to use that. And then I think a question we always ask ourselves is, are we actually honest brokers? And one of the things when we send it out to the 20 or 30 stakeholders is to say, we're trying to be honest brokers, are we actually being it? And I think especially in the insecticide one, we'd send it out to the industry, the chemical industry, and they say, well, the way you phrase that automatically assumes insecticides are bad. And then we'd send it out to an environmental NGO, and they'll come back and say, the way you phrase that automatically assumes you have to have insecticides. And you can never completely be an honest broker. The mere fact that we discussed the evidence on culling badgers meant that we had said that that is part of the policy set that might be applied. We did not review the evidence of using cyanide to gas badger sets, as used to be done in the past. So even choosing what you include in has an element of subjectivity. So I think we don't claim to be honest brokers, but we claim to aspire to be honest brokers, and we claim to show our workings so that you can call us out when we're not. So in the last 5 minutes, I just want to say a few things about some of the current issues on science advice, and also some of the things that sort of has struck me looking at the way science advice has worked over the last 2 years during the pandemic. And again, I'm going to come to no conclusions. This is partly to stimulate discussion and questions. And I should start by saying 2 things. First of all, I've had no involvement whatsoever in science advice over COVID. So what I'm about to say is purely from the outside and looking in. And the other thing, and just to sort of put my cards on the table, I think that Yeah, I'm sure not everything has gone right, but I think science advice over COVID has been really an outstanding success. I think it is great to see the trust in science going out. I think the two individuals in particular, Patrick Vallance, the current government chief scientific advisor, and the chief medical officer, Chris Whitty, even when they have to stand in the new Downing Street press briefing, which was described by one commentator as having the architectural style of Nuremberg Radisson, which I rather liked. I think they have done a really tremendous job. So I come from that prior. I think we have seen two narratives, both of which are wrong, about how science has fed into policy over the pandemic. One is that it's followed the science, and the other, which is perhaps a little nearer, that scientists are on tap, but not on top. And it's much more complicated than that. And those of you who are social scientists, this will be no surprise to you. There's a really complex process of co-creation of science advice. And that involves trust between the scientists, between the politicians and the people giving the science advice. And people have worried about Vallance and Whitty standing up there beside the Prime Minister and saying, shouldn't they be separate from that? But surely that is part of building the trust and building the co-creation. I think one of the issues, and you don't have to be a fan of Dominic Cummings, but Dominic Cummings has written about some of the issues about scientific literacy within government and the importance of having a greater cadre of people who can understand and process the information coming in. Another issue that's really struck me is the confidentiality versus transparency. For 7 years, I chaired DEFRA's Science Advisory Council, and when I took over, everything was minuted in quite some detail. And in consequence to that, then no serious discussion happened at the meetings, and the transparency actually pushed the advice out into the corridor. And we sort of changed the way we work. We're very clear about the topics that we discussed, but we talked about them what we called workshop session. I mean, it is a cardinal sin of a civil servant, especially in the 24-hour news cycle, to embarrass their ministers. So there has to be a way of allowing that space. And so I was more on the confidentiality than the transparency side. But I think COVID is the exception that proves the rule. We were being asked to do things that were so dramatic that having that out more transparent was the right answer there. And I think Patrick Vallance was very much right in pushing for transparency quite early on. Of course, government has set up, and this is something I think we should be really proud of in the UK, a system by which scientific advisors calling on a much broader community of people input science into policymakers. But there are other sources of science advice as well, and we've seen a tension of this over the pandemic. Roger Pierco, who I mentioned earlier on, has a very interesting blog about this as well. And he talks about, and in fact, although American, he uses a British parliamentary analogy. He talks about shadow science advice. And he says which groups are being the loyal opposition, and argues that some are trying to do that, and then worries that other groups are actually moving into advocacy. And I think we've seen some tensions there. I think one of the really valuable learning things when we get to the other end is how that works. Something that's another issue is obviously one possible criticism of having a particular way that science goes into policy is dangers of groupthink. And I think an interesting thing that is done in the military is to have a specific red group, a group that is sort of tasked with constructively criticizing the advice as it's coming in. And I think that is something that one might think about. I love the expression epistemic creep. It reminds me of how one might describe a particularly unpleasant philosopher. And what it is the fact, and we're all guilty of it to some extent, of the temptation to prognosticate outside one's own field. And I think if one looks at the people who have been contributing to the debates on the media over the last two years, and there have been a huge number of scientists on the media, we've seen a complete spectrum between people who are doing wonderful things and sticking within their own field, to people who you wonder, why on earth are they talking about that? And this is such a difficult question, because who has a choice? I mean, who has a voice? This is clearly something we don't want to legislate to. How do we as a research community do this better? I wonder whether the academies have more of a role in it. I think the Royal Academy of Medicine was quite good about that in the pandemic. I think the Royal Society, to be honest, has been less successful. I can't talk at an event co-sponsored by Reuters without saying something about the news media. I think if one looks first at the traditional media, it's been really quite fabulous, the vast majority of the reporting. I know many people in the Royal Mile are great fans of the Science Media Centre in London and Fiona Fox. It's been great what's happened there. As someone who for 30 years has been trying to drum in the concept of R0 to recalcitrant undergraduates, I think it's extraordinary one can have a conversation about R0 with one's neighbours. This weekend I was commiserating with my neighbour about the molehills in his garden. He said, yes, the mole R0 is way above 1 at the moment. So I think there's some really positive lessons to learn from that. One thing that, now I'm not sure if this worries me or it doesn't worry me, and I'd be very interested to hear what the Reuters people say. So in the peak of the pandemic, we had on the BBC News hugely talented journalists going into ICUs and showing the horrors that were there. And I think personally that was one of the really major drivers for the change in behaviour. And I think probably a huge number of lives were saved for that. But it worries me slightly that that was a decision made in an editorial room in a news organisation. Am I right to be worried about that? I don't know. And then social media. I mean, social media has been a jungle. We still haven't worked out the challenge of living in the age of platform power. That surely is something we need to learn more. And then just finally, politicisation. So politicisation, to a certain extent, was always us. I mean, but at the moment, the sort of historical balance between what you might call the individualist and the communitarian approach to the way we run our societies has gone quite far towards the individual side, both on the left and the right. And again, a response to an epidemic almost certainly has to have a small c communitarian side to it. And this has proved really hard, and I very much worry that some of the discourse at the moment, especially attacking the modelling community and talking about models being wrong when they were never predictions, they were projections. I think that is something that we need to look at. I'm going to stop there because I have gone out on 5 minutes more than I said I would. So let me finish there. If you are interested in restatements, then there is a reference there. And let me finish you with badgers and cow living in harmony together.
Thank you so much for an incredible lecture and also for giving us a chance to spend the evening looking again at badgers and cows. And I was a journalist in Wales reporting on bovine TB outbreak, and it was a very polarising story and genuinely heartbreaking to speak to the farmers who felt completely trapped and
I've spoken to a 50-year-old farmer about bovine TB, and he's burst into tears. I mean, it has a major effect.
Absolutely, and I think it's really important what you're talking about, putting the facts out there and diffusing, lowering the volume or lowering the temperature of public debate. Can I ask you, so that I don't go into epistemic creep, and I am a journalist, about a bit more about the role of the media as you see it? When you put out these restatements and your target audience are informed stakeholders, do you, at the back of your mind, also think about how this is going to play out in the media, or is that something you leave to others?
No, we do. So our prime audience is the policymakers. But of course, the way it's a public document, so the way that it is interpreted by the media makes a difference. And well, you heard me saying what fans, both Angela and I, are of the Science Media Centre. I think virtually all our restatements have been launched at the Science Media Centre. And Fiona Fox just does a great job of bringing in the expert. To be honest, the journalists are used to coming in to get a story, and it is an argument to say, look, this isn't a story, but we're trying to do something that you should have in the bottom of your drawer for when there is a next story and you're needing to interpret it. And of course, journalists have deadlines and things. It's really hard for them, but a number have used them like that.
Because that was my next question, and then I'll bring it out to the audience, so do please raise your hands. But what would be your ideal relationship with journalists? Would you like them to come to you as a scientific community? Would you prefer to just be able to publish and have them go to the work? How willing are you to kind of engage? Because we've had a lot of conversations, especially over our climate network, with a lot of climate scientists saying the difficulty we have is reporting uncertainty, reporting predictions and models, and speaking to journalists who are unable or unwilling to accept the nuance and uncertainty in the situation, and then being called up 6 months later and said, well, you're wrong, because that's not how it works.
So if one's trying to look for a silver lining of the pandemic, I think some of these complex issues around uncertainty have been discussed far more than used to be in the past. I know this will mean nothing to anyone looking in from overseas, but radio programs such as More or Less. I mean, whoever thought that a program on statistics on the radio would actually have a cult following and things?
This is by Tim Harford.
Tim Harford from the Financial Times. Another point I'd make is I worry about the emphasis we have at the moment on getting... whenever you have a research grant, you have to sort of talk how you're going to publicize it. I think many press officers, for the best of all possible motives, are trying to make a story. And I think this sort of bids up the significance of everything. And going back to what we're saying, a lot of this is actually at the level of scientists talking to scientists. And I think we have out of kilter at the moment how we are trying to encourage our community to promulgate their results to a wider public. I mean, I don't know the answer to this. This is your world, not mine, but I worry about the perverse incentives that we're giving our researchers at the moment.
I'd really like to go into that more, but I will take it out to the room. So, Denise, please.
Thank you very much, Charles. A wonderful talk. I'm a social statistician, and one of the things that I always aspire to be policy relevant but politically neutral. But it's quite difficult in social science because just the issues that I choose to study, the questions that I ask, the methodology that I use, all influences the results, and it all does stem from my views of the topic. What I really liked about your reinstatements is that you could use that as an aspiration, and then you can see ways in which you can depart from it, and being open about your methodology. So I'd like you to comment on that. And then the other point I wanted to make is, as a statistician, I follow the codes of conduct from my discipline. And the code of conduct talks about overclaiming, which is some of what you were talking about a minute ago, but it also talks about avoiding the temptations to go beyond your expertise. And I've seen people in my own discipline area fail at that over the last 2 years, being tempted to speak way beyond their expertise. And I wondered what we should be doing about that as an academy.
Thanks, Denise. Actually, just with an anecdote to begin with, epistemic creep can happen by accident. And about 20 years ago, I was rung up by a Scottish newspaper asking about the theory that if you grow up in a too clean household, then you might be immune deficient. And I said, I know nothing about this, but you should talk to ABCD. And I thought nothing about it. 2 years later, I'm quoted in the Daily Mail. And I only heard about this when, well, an immunologist friend of mine rang me up and called me an epistemic creep, or they're not using those exact words. So it's just curious. I assume that someone wrote a note that I'd said go and talk to that, and it got associated with me. But that was a silly anecdote. I think the code of contact that you have in statistics, I'm not aware of anything equivalent to that for us in the straight sciences, and that's something that we should learn about. We were talking just before the talk. Statistics, the Office of National Statistics has done a wonderful job during the pandemic. I think that's been really important. Yes, I think both Angela and I really stress that we are not claiming to be honest brokers, we're aspiring to be an honest broker, and that always is. I was saying that you medics had it easier than us natural scientists. I think you social scientists have it much harder than us, because at least when we do an experiment on badgers, they don't read the protocol and then potentially, well, in some cases I sometimes wonder if they do, but at least in theory they don't. I think there is also, there are strands within social science where your political stance is part of the way that you work. And you know, in the natural sciences, I'm old enough to remember where there were Marxist evolutionary biologists who used Marxist theory as a way of interpreting evolutionary results. And that has gone out of the way. But that's not the same for parts of the social science, parts of economics. The much lamented Bob May, Lord May, used to, I think jokingly, refer to economics as a faith-based discipline, which is very unfair, but a slight element of truth in it.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, thank you very much. I could ask so many different questions, but I'll declare my interest because I am a senior civil servant in a government science agency, but I'm also a student here, and I've published about the organisation of scientific advice in the first wave of COVID. So I was really interested in what you said, and one of the points that struck me, and it's not an original point, I got this from hearing God speak. And by God, I mean Gus O'Donnell, yeah. Who gave a really interesting talk midway through the pandemic, arguing that essentially the model that I think many of us had accepted was the automatic model of separating scientific advice giving and decision making, the ministers decide, advisors advise principle, was fundamentally flawed. And that maybe we should have a different model, much more like that used in the National Security Council, where advisors and ministers sit round the table together and thus co-produce the answer, and of course in complete confidence, because we know when ministers have tweeted out of that meeting, they've had serious consequences. What do you think of that alternative model compared to the one that we've got very embedded, I think, in our thinking, and has been very dominant through the high-profile role of SAGE and SPI-B and SPI-M?
So I think that's the way it actually happens. I think it is a fault in my community, the natural science community, that we don't realize that. I think the social scientists have been well ahead of this. So social scientist who I think is wonderful and has written very interesting this is Sue Owen from Cambridge. And she talks about the different models and sort of argues that exactly what you've described is de jure the way it happens. and I don't know what happens in the military world, national security world, but perhaps more explicitly realizing that in some of the fields that I've talked about would be helpful in moving forward.
The structure was a separation. Sorry, the structure was a separation between SAGE and COBRA that set out, and then COBRA was adapted into this COVID-O and COVID-S position. I'm getting into too much detail, but that was the formal structure. And my observation, from being quite close to a lot of it, was that the way in which those two interacted was pretty limited. It wasn't what I would see as co-production of real deliberative decision-making.
That's interesting, and I can't comment on the COVID decision-making, but certainly my experience in DEFRA, which has sort of often puts evidence and policy in different units and things, that can hinder the development of coherent policy. And sort of, again, I'm thinking about in the DEFRA light, then doing what you say more explicitly might be helpful.
The gentleman behind, I think. Did you have a question?
Thank you, Professor. This was very interesting. I'm a visiting fellow here at the Reuters Institute, and my prior life is in business and in politics. And so in many decision constellations, you're faced with expert advice, right? And the calculus that's going on always in the back of your mind is this advocacy now, or is it expertise? Or what would be your advice to decision makers, what questions to ask of experts and how to ask them?
So I'm going to try and answer it, and then I'm not going to allow Angela to completely get away. So Angela, you might have an answer to that. Do you have an answer before me?
What are you most worried I might ask you?
That's a very good answer. Mm-hmm. I guess one of the things that is sort of behind restatements is showing your workings and having it out there so it can be criticized. Actually, I think one of the things that we were really delighted, there was a debate in the House of Commons on neonicotinoid insecticides, and we just produced a restatement from that. And the government is a coalition government, and the Labour Party had different views on that. And in the debate, both the minister and the shadow minister quoted restatements, but in a way that that was the basis. And now let's get on to talk about the policy implications. So I'm not really answering your question. I've gone off on a tangent. But that, to me, is, I think that's probably when we sort of felt, yeah, that is something that really worked well.
Thank you.
I'm doing 2 microphones.
Yes, I've lost track of microphones. Try Tim.
So we've seen a lot of outsourcing from the government over the last few years, some of it less successful, some of it more successful. And you have a model where you're able to be the evidence base or the evidence digest instead of an internal system. To what extent is your financial independence, or 3 degrees of financial separation, or whatever it is, how important is that to you and your credibility and your trust brand? Or is there a world in which government or other organisations could say, here's the question, can 3 organisations bid for it and answer the question, and your credibility goes with the workings and so on? Does that already happen? It's not my world.
Some science advice is outsourced and is done by a competitive process, as you would imagine. This is but that tends to be where there is a specific need. You know, what is the evidence for something like this? I think what we're doing here is something a little bit different, and it's picking contentious issues. And I think the separation is absolutely critical. And you know, it's very nice. Parts of government have offered us money because we're being useful, and we've turned it down because, please don't tell the Vice-Chancellor that, because it would really undermine what we're doing. Now, we're very privileged that in the Martin School we have some funds to do it. I have to say these things are not hugely expensive. And they're not hugely expensive because, and I should have stressed this much more, but we rely on the enthusiasm of wonderful people to take part in these processes. And, you know, Angela and I, at the end of the day, have sort of been completely exhausted, but it's been just a privilege to have these people debating complex science in a very constructive way. And in fact, what it costs is that we just make certain that while they're in Oxford, they have an interesting time intellectually, and we give them a good meal the night before. Now, you could find a way of funding this from government by setting up a completely blind trust or something like that. But even then, there would be it would be open to misinterpretation even if that was unfair. So to me, this is one of the things that HEIs can contribute to policymakers. And to be honest, nice things happen to us in Oxford that we perhaps don't deserve. So this is one way that this university in particular can contribute, if that doesn't sound too pious. And I should say that well, we are hugely grateful to people from the academic community and beyond who have engaged with these projects.
Thank you. Rasmus. And then guy at the back.
Thanks very much, Charles. It's tremendously interesting and really insightful. I'm going to say something and then put a question mark at the end to hear what you think about it, but bear with me for a second. I wonder whether one can agree with everything you said at the end about your worries about the sort of the policies that seem to incentivize publicity for scientists, and the individual temptation to sort of engage in epistemic creep, which is always something we will say that others are doing and rarely something we would ever admit that we might ourselves do. It's always epistemic creep when someone else. Whether one could sort of recognize the problems you described there and still at the same time believe, which I suppose I do, that the far bigger problem are all the reasons scientists have to not make themselves available for policymaking and for journalists who are trying to do an honest job of informing the public about what science might contribute on a particular issue of the day. It seems to me that even as quote-unquote impact is being sort of put on universities as one measure of success, that is at the level of departments and rarely individual researchers, whereas in particular early career and mid-career academics are facing absolutely ruthless pressures to publish or perish in peer-reviewed journals that are only read by scientific peers. And for the vast majority of them, any kind of public communication or policy engagement is a second shift that, as you alluded to yourself, is primarily something that is the sort of the luxury of those of us who are privileged enough to have fixed positions and are sort of relatively advanced in our careers. And I suppose I'm personally, I recognize the issues you described, but I suppose I'm more worried about all the reasons scientists might have to say, well, you know, we're going to just leave that to others. And of course, the problem is that policymaking, like nature, abhors a vacuum. So it's not like that will just mean that there won't be input. It's just that it'll be different kinds of input and often more nakedly self-interested. And a lot of it will be presented as research, and it will be research in a sense, but it'll be research in a quite a different sense. And I would say that it's it'll often be more political than even those scientists who are sort of fairly openly advocating for something, and often less rigorous. So I suppose I recognize the problems you described, but I guess I'm personally more worried about the second set of problems that are sort of nested within.
I mean, Rasmus, that's a really good point. And if I gave the impression I was trying to encourage less links between the academy and the world of journalism and the media, I absolutely don't mean that. And I think one of the nice things that's happened in the 30 years since I've been an academic is that the slight snobbishness about teledons and things like that has gone away. And actually people who are really good in the media are lionized, and rightly so. I was making a slightly narrower point, and the narrower point I was making is the incentives to perhaps over-egg the policy relevance in particular of research. I'm almost more worried about that than overestimating the scientific relevance of it, because that may matter a little. But you do see really good studies, and I'm not going to name any of them, really good studies that then extrapolate far beyond what they've said, and then actually undermine the really good, and I don't mean this in a derogatory sense, really good but incremental work. And I think it is concomitant upon us within academy to be more modest about what we claim, but still engage. And within the journalist world to make stories that are interesting but don't rely on world breakthrough or policy has changed and things like that. And it can be done. And actually, now I'm going to be an old fart, I think you go back 20 or 30 years ago for the slightly longer form articles that one got, which are rarer, I think, today, and perhaps more commoner in some of the quality press in the States. But then perhaps I'm just being an old-fashioned talking about press. I mean, social media is a jungle as well, which...
I think you're getting a lot of that in podcasts and other formats as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Toby. I'm a DPhil student here working on infectious disease modelling. Both the official government scientific advice committees and other groups such as your work, as sort of British, like UK-based bodies, seem to be quite well established at providing scientific advice to governments. And I was wondering, although maybe not perfect, but like, are there things that scientific advice bodies for the WHO or for other national governments in high-income and low-income and middle-income countries as well could learn from the approaches in the UK towards scientific advice to policymakers?
Thank you, Toby. That's a great question. I don't want to be smug or nationalistic, but I think we do it very well in this country, but we can obviously do it better. I think that if you look at the countries that have chief scientific advisors, there is now an organization, and Angela, you may know what it's called, that brings together chief scientific advisors to... Angela's giving me a look away look, so I may be making this up completely. But I think there is an organization which swaps best practice on it. I've worked in particular with FAO, and they have a really interesting science structure there. There are great complexities in international organizations, more so than single governments. I think some of the quality of the science advice going into WHO, FAO is superb, and actually have really tough jobs in some of them.
Thank you. And I think the last question, Paula.
Hi, hello, I am Paula Molina from Chile. I'm part of the Reuters Institute. I'm a fellow at the Reuters Institute. And I'd like to ask you a little bit more about the role of Brian May, not only because he's the guitarist of a fantastic band that I like.
Forgive me,
The role of Brian May.
Brian May, yes.
Yes. But I think I would like to know more about that, because I think policymakers face this tension, between influencers who try to make a business of challenging science, and when so many politicians are also tempted to follow popular ideas instead of science-based ideas. So how do experts navigate that, and which options of collaboration or dispute you see in that process, in that realm?
That's a really great question. I'm not sure I can give an answer in general. I mean, I will sort of flesh out the Brian May thing. So when I was asked 3 years ago to review current government policy on bovine TB, then we did a series of meetings with the industry, with the veterinary profession, and then with the NGOs who are campaigning against culling. And Brian May came along to one of the... Well, I'll tell you another anecdote. So I happened to be at the desk in death row with him, And he didn't have a bit of identification. And the person behind the desk in DEFRA was saying, I need an identification. He's searching himself. It's Brian May, you know, completely. So I said, well, can't you play something, Brian? You know? But he found something. But during the meeting, some of the people from the NGO community who care so deeply about it, I'm not criticizing them, you know, would get a bit upset. And Brian, who cares very deeply about it, was just saying, no, calm down, let's keep this going. And he was just a force for good in having a reasoned discussion. And the person I met in the CSA at DEFRA at the time, Ian Boyd, was just very good as well at reaching out to that community as well as to the farmers and trying to, I mean, deep divisions still remain and was not trying to paper over that. But the discourse is calmer and more respectful now than it was 10 years ago.
Thank you. I think it's a really interesting point for the role influencer can play in taking the heat out of a situation rather than adding to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're kind of close out of time, but it was actually